Well, it's 9:30, so I'm going to start. I know we still have people joining, but the nature of these community meetings is we know people drop in and out, and join as they can. It's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Oxhardy. I should just say, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Abbott, and together with my amazing colleague Belinda Stone, I am a co-director of the Old Vine Conference. The Old Vine Conference was founded 4 years ago. It was a lockdown project when we all had a bit more time on our hands. And it was founded really, from my experience as a marketer of regions and bodies for my main company, from a desire and a conviction really to bring people together, all the fellowship of people around the world who see the value in old vine genetics, old vine culture, heritage, know-how, to actually elevate and raise awareness for this category, this very important category, which I think is very much about the future of wine as well as about our cultural past. So, more information about the Old Vine Conference is at our website, www.oldvines.org. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's great to see so many familiar names. It's my great pleasure that we have with us Andrew Oxhardy today. Andrew is a really, an iconic figure, if I could say that, in Australian wine. And I would just like to share a personal thanks because nearly 30 years ago, when I was in my late 20s and just starting to study wine for the started study for the MW, I had an incredible visit to Australia over 2 weeks, and I was hosted in Clare Valley at Napstein by Andrew himself, and I had an incredible tasting with you. And I'll never forget the generosity and the transparency of everything that you were kind enough to share with me on that visit. So it's great to see you again, Andrew. Can I just ask, why are you called Ox?
Oh, it's a story that goes back to school, but I can't believe it's 30 years or 30 plus years since you were in Clare, Sarah. So it ages me anyway, but that's fine. But it was always lovely to have visitors in Clare at the winery and show off what we were doing. Ox is a schoolboy nickname from grade 5 at school. I changed schools and we were playing basketball, and I was tall for my age, and I barged through a pack. And one of my new friends said, "You bloody great Ox," and it stuck. So I'm called Ox by nearly everybody except my wife and my mother, but my grandkids all call me Ox, so I'm Ox to most people. So it's one of those simple nicknames that stuck. It's quite fun.
Yeah, wonderful. And your personal sort of wine project, Ox Hardy, obviously takes this very personal nickname because this is a project that's really personal to you. So you've worked for leading wineries all across Australia, but tell us about Ox Hardy. Your great great grandfather bought this vineyard in Upper Tintara in 1871. Is that right? What do
Yes,
you know
right.
about him, and what can you tell us about him?
We were, like, as you said, my great great grandfather bought the vineyard. It was planted by a consortium of wealthy Adelaide businessmen in the early 1860s. It was cleared in 1861. They built a winery in 1863. They planted vineyards from 1863 on. There's an aerial shot that Belinda's just put up. And he bought it from the receivers. So that Dr. Kelly, who was Dr. A.C. Kelly, who was one of the founders of viticulture in South Australia, led the consortium that planted it. And not forgetting McLaren Vale now, it's only sort of 25 minutes out of the city, but back then it was a day on a horse to get down there. So it was sort of out in the country back then. Dr. Kelly planted this vineyard with a consortium, and they called it, originally they were going to call the vineyard Tintinara, which is a town on the way to the southeast of South Australia. And they decided, even back then they had marketers, they decided Tintinara was too long, so they shortened it to Tintara. And our vineyard therefore became known as Upper Tintara Vineyard. And my cousin John Hardy still owns Lower Tintara Vineyard. So these vineyards have been in our family since 1871, when the original Thomas Hardy bought them from the receivers. So very historic. And Tom Hardy was the original. Tom Hardy was kind of looked at as one of the founders of McLaren Vale and one of the founders of the South Australian wine industry. Actually, he was very prominent early on. He consulted in Coonawarra. Even back then they had consultants. He consulted to people in Coonawarra about how to grow grapes. So it does go back all those years, and happily for me, these vineyards passed down through our direct family, and my brother and sister and I have ended up owning it. When Dad retired from Hardy's after a big merger back in 1991, he went back to the vineyard and basically retired there and just ran it. And we started making, we started making a bit of wine just for fun, just for drinking at home. And I kept saying to him, Dad, let's do a label. Let's do a label together. And he kept putting me off and kept putting me off. And then he finally said to me, you can do it when I'm dead. So I waited till he died and I did it, which is very sad in a way, but it's also, at least I got to do it. So I would have much rather have done it with Dad. But anyway, that's the way it ended up. So that's kind of a short story of how the label came around.
And what was he like, your dad? What was it like working with him? Was it sort of was he a sort of a good, tough teacher? And did you always know that you wanted to follow that family path? Did you ever consider anything else, or was it really sort of your destiny?
No, I started when I left school. I was doing agricultural science at Adelaide University, and I wanted to be a farmer. And I think that was in the late 70s. Excuse me. And the wine industry was in one of its downturns at the time, and it was a pretty grim place to be. And Dad didn't really encourage me to go in the wine industry, but I'd always been down to the vineyard. Excuse me. Always been part of being down there and riding motorbikes, doing things that kids do in vineyards. And so I started doing ag science, and then one morning woke up on a sheep station out the back of New South Wales and thought, do you know what? I really actually do want to be a winemaker. So I finished that job, came back to university, and started mucking around in wine. And I actually worked for Brian Crozer at Petaluma in the early days of Petaluma. I worked there from 82 till 2018. So not only did I have a quite strict father, I had a very strict boss. For those of you that are online that know Brian Crozer, he was a hard taskmaster. So it was good learning curve.
Yeah, yeah. Built a lot of a lot of discipline and knowledge as well. I mean, two really iconic names. And what do you know why your great grandfather, why he really wanted that site at Blewett Springs? What's special about it?
I think even then he realised by then he'd been making wine in South Australia. He started making wine, learning the game with Walter Rennell at Ranella in the late 1840s. And by 1853, he'd started a wine company which became known as Thomas Hardy and Sons. And so by 1871, he was at sort of the height of his powers. He was making wine from suburban Adelaide. He was buying He was buying grapes up in the Adelaide Hills. He'd started buying grapes in the Southern Vales. And I think he was just one of those people that was looking around, what opportunities could come up. And I think Blewett Springs, it's right on the edge of the Adelaide Hills. So we get the benefit of the cool night air from the Adelaide Hills drains down into Blewett Springs. We're the highest part of McLaren Vale. So we not only do we get the cool breeze from the Adelaide Hills, but we also get the influence of the Gulf St Vincent, which is a pretty large body of seawater not far, which helps McLaren Vale with the Mediterranean climate. So I think he really realised that the McLaren Vale was a really, really good place to grow grapes, and moderate climate, and it got enough rainfall back then. I mean, the long-term average is 21, 22 inches, so it's a decent rainfall. Of course, back then most things were grown dryland; they didn't really pump water for irrigation, so it was all very modest yield. So I think he just truly recognised from having made wine from all over South Australia that it was a pretty spectacular place. And when it came up, I think he was in the right place at the right time, and I guess happily for him, had the money to be able to buy it from the receivers,
Yeah.
and crank it up.
Yeah. So you still have this 2.5 hectare site of this ancestor block of these vines that were basically date back to this time. That's really incredible.
Yeah, we've got 2.5 hectares left of the vineyard. The whole vineyard's about 40 hectares. The whole property is about 140 hectares. So we've got cattle and sheep and fair bit of scrub. But of the original vineyard, there is only, well, sadly, there's only 2.5 hectares left. But at least I've got the 2.5 hectares, and I think they were planted. I know they were planted in 1891. We've just done, as part of the old, or as an offshoot of the Old Vine project, the Australian Wine Research Institute, which is the premier research body for wine and viticulture in Australia, has just done a study on all the old vine Shiraz in Australia. So they're doing a DNA study to try and work out maybe, where the vines might have come from. There's a shot of the old vines while we're picking last year. So they've just done a DNA sample just at the end of vintage this year, 25, and they are trying to work out where all the old identifiably 1800s Shiraz comes from. Did it come from the MacArthur collection in Sydney? Did it come from Cape of Good Hope? Where did it come from? So
Yeah.
I haven't got those results yet, but that'll be fascinating when we find that out, because we really don't know where it came from. We now call it Bob's clone because my father was Bob,
Yeah.
and we've used a lot of the cuttings from the vineyard to plant new blocks in the vineyard, and also in other vineyards. So other friends have taken cuttings,
Yeah.
and they're growing from those genetics. So it's going to be fascinating when they actually tell me where it came from, because there's lots of good stories about where all the original grapevines came from. But Busby in Sydney, MacArthur in Sydney. So it goes back to the first fleet, or it might go back to the first fleet. We don't really know yet.
I was speaking to Andrew Kayard, MW, and author of The Australian Ark, and he's got me completely hooked on this actually really compelling kind of almost mystery story of this aspect of Australian wine heritage, where all these plantings have come from, and how actually all these kind of generations of effort um, have led to this incredible uh, genetic vine resource that it seems that it's in relatively recent years that AWRRI and the kind of the industry as a whole has really kind of come together to really work out what the story and the path has been.
It's quite incredible, and Andrew's Kayard's book is just I'm on the third volume at the moment, about halfway through it. It's incredible. I mean, it took him 15 or 20 years to write it, and the research is amazing. But the history behind the early days of Australian viticulture and winemaking it's really fascinating. It's a great, especially for I mean, not especially for anybody, but I love reading it because there's a lot of references to people I know and obviously the South Australian wine industry. But and I think that the old vine part of that whole story is amazing. And I've got my cousin John Hardy, who's got Lower Tintara Vineyard. He's got some Sauvignon Blanc that goes back to 1885. And we believe one of Thomas Hardy, one of his letters, he travelled amazingly. Those winemakers, even back then in the 1800s, they travelled incredibly widely, and he travelled many times to back to Europe, to America, to the Cape of Good Hope, and was researching viticulture and winemaking even in those days. And one of the stories is that in his book is that he brought back cuttings from Chateau Yquem. So we think we might have Sauvignon Blanc from Sauterne growing in McLaren Vale still. I've still got some genetic material from that, but John Hardy, my cousin's got a vineyard still planted, still growing beautiful fruit that dates from 1885. So it's not just the Shiraz. Shiraz is probably at the moment the sort of focus, but we know there's a lot of old Grenache still in Australia, and we know there's bits and pieces of old Mataro, or Mourvedre, and Sauvignon Blanc and others. So it's going to, as this research trundles on, it's going to be more and more fascinating to see, what's thrown up, because it'd be really nice to know and of course, if the truth gets in the way of a good story, it will keep the good story going.
Yeah. Be careful what you find.
Yeah.
Before I ask you to talk in more detail about the incredible work you're doing with at Ox Hardy, I have got a question from Hamish Thompson. Is that Hamish from Best's? Um, I think it must be. Hamish's question is, Andrew, was the Shiraz study only in South Australia or all Australia? I don't recall them coming to us. Um, do you know, Andrew, whether that was?
I think the plan is for it to be all of Australia. And
Yeah,
Hamish, I'm not sure why they wouldn't have thought about Bess, which is weird. I just assumed they were going everywhere. I will find out though. I mean, AWI is based in South Australia, based near here where I am. But so maybe they've just started South Australia. But the whole aim is to go back and say, is the hunter material that almost certainly would have come. I mean, that wouldn't have crossed borders. That would have come out of Sydney, out of MacArthur or Busby collection.
yeah,
Is there a link back from these vineyards that have spread around Australia? Is there a link back to Sydney or back to the original? So I'm surprised, Hamish, they haven't come to you. When I speak to the chap whose name I've just forgotten at AWRI, I've got to speak to him soon, actually. I'll ask him, because I mean, he didn't know about the Sauvignon Blanc at John Hardy's, and I've also got an old patch of 1947 Cabernet, and so I paid to have that research done, because I'd like to know where that came from, and we just don't know.
yeah,
But I will ask, Hamish, I will ask about that, because my assumption and my belief was that they were going to do all of Australia, wherever they could find the old vines, which is really only going to be you guys, some hunter stuff, and here in South Australia, there's not much else really left of the really old gear.
yeah. Fantastic. Well, hopefully that's we can help with that connection. And
Yeah,
um, on we find this all the time when we're talking and bringing and holding these sessions with the for the Old Wine Conference, because in a way the value. Oh, sorry about that. Because the value of this almost this resource, it was so nearly lost. And there's a lot of people all over the world working with incredible plots and actually who didn't know about each other. So it's like now we're sort of waking up to the need um to log this, to treat it as just as
yeah.
important as seller records. But it's there's an element of the whole industry everywhere actually doing a bit of catch up. Um,
And I think it's lovely that the question's often asked, why did these vines survive? Well, they survived because they made great wine. So the only reason they didn't get pulled out of the ground at whatever stage in the proceedings was they were making great wine. So they've survived because they're great plots, not because not. I mean, they're not great just because they're old, but they're actually survivors of a lot of different. I mean, we had the vine pool scheme in South Australia in the mid-80s, where growers were encouraged to pull vineyards up, and it was kind of a response to a glut back then of red, fortified, but also red wine. And there were some vineyards that were lost in that vine pool scheme that was sponsored by the government. But the good vineyards, some really good vineyards got saved, and happily, we've got one of them, and there's a few scattered through South Australia and Victoria,
yeah,
and
wonderful.
New South Wales.
Um, Andrew, take us through the project at Ox Hardy. I know you've got some slides and some great info to share with us. I think Belinda's going to share put the slides on the screen.
Thank you, Belinda. So Ox is, like I said, started out as a hobby, making wine with Dad. Wanting to do something. I sort of did it as a sideline while I was working at Petaluma, just as a bit of fun. And I only really ever made about 1,000 bottles a year, but I built up an inventory from 2008. And when I left Petaluma in 2018, I had 10 vintages minus. I didn't make a 9 and I didn't make an 11. So I had all this wine, not knowing what the hell I was going to do with it. But I always had a thing that I wanted to do an Ox Hardy label. So we've got a few other wines as well, but the real jewel in the crown of it is this 2.5 hectare block, of which I only use a portion of. So Ox Ancestor Vine Shiraz is only ever about 1,000 bottles, 1,000 to 1,200 bottles, so it's small production. And it's just it's a lovely way to sort of look at. I mean, it's kind of neat making wine from vineyards that your great-grandfathers planted. I love that history part of it. And the fact they've survived is wonderful, and they're looked after like dear old people. They're all hand pruned, hand picked. That's a slide of me and my son, and that's me bucketing fruit out. But it's a project of passion, a passionate project. That slide is of the original winery, which, as you can see, is a bit of a ruin. But those slate fermenters that you're sort of looking at, the rectangles, they were built in 1863. They were used in a building, so there were 21 of them originally in a building. They were used from 1863 up until 1928. Depends who you believe, 1928 or 1923. And then they were not used again until 2018 when I started. I used a couple of them in 2018. So it's really a ruin. It's got no power there. It's all done by hand. But again, that's local slate from McLaren Vale's near a little town called Willunga. And in Willunga, there's a big slate deposit. There were two quarries. There are still two quarries, one called Delabole and one called Bangor, both named after Cornish slate quarries. And they were not used for interesting slate. Must have been different. The other big slate quarry in South Australia is at Mintero, which is just out of Clare. And that's where they made all the billiard tables from. So that was a billiard table slate, whereas this slate in Willunga is quite flaky, and it was used to make roof tiles for all the cottages. So when you go into Willunga and some places in McLaren Vale, the roof tiles or the roof on the houses are slate because it flakes quite a bit. But anyway, this winery stood until the 670s, actually. And sadly, in South Australia, there was a period where nobody really cared about history and heritage, and the building was pulled down, and the fermenters were used for other things, which is terribly sad. So there's only those five left standing there. One of the stories that I like to tell is that I didn't know where the building went. It was a substantial building. It was a winery building with 2 barrel sheds, all the fermenter space, press space, and a crusher. And it was driven by a horse, 1 horsepower. So the horse went round and round in circles and drove the crusher. We've got drawings of that and photos. When I used to question my father, where did the building go? There's no remnants of the building other than that wall behind those fermenters. And he said, I don't know where it went. Anyway, it turned out I was having lunch with Mark Maxwell one day 2 years ago. He's another winemaker from McLaren Vale. And I was telling him the story. He said, I know where it went. And when he was at school, after school every afternoon, he used to be paid to go and cart on a horse and cart. This is in the 70s. Cart our ironstone, back to Wirrawirra. So Wirrawirra Winery has got the walls from my old winery. So I have made an ambit claim to Wirrawirra to the various winemakers here, saying I'm going to come and get my building back one day, but I don't know whether I can pull it down. But that's where the building went. So at least it wasn't wasted. And a lot of the timbers that were in the original building were reused in the main street of McLaren Vale, where Thomas Hardy had bought the old flour mill in 1876, and he used a lot of the timbers in there to rebuild that flour mill into a winery, which is still today the Tintara Winery in McLaren Vale. So kind of neat. Anyway, Wirrawirra have got my building.
And this is one of your old vines.
So that's one of the old vines. You can see the way it's grown up. It was originally probably about a foot off the ground, and then it was taken up to another cordon, which has been chopped off, and then it was taken up again. So they're sort of up high off the ground. They're really fragile. We're really careful. The only thing that appears to kill them really so far, and I'm touching wood as I'm saying this, because we don't have phylloxera in South Australia, is tractors. So if a tractor hits one, they're terribly, terribly fragile. So consequently, those 2.5 hectares, the guy that works for me that's been down there for nearly 30 years, he's the only one that drives a tractor through there. So we treat them incredibly carefully because it is, we don't want to lose them, and it's we've got the genetics at least, so we've replanted blocks, but I don't want to lose any more of those old vines. And as I say, it would appear in the absence of phylloxera that there's nothing really that I hope there's nothing really that will knock them over, other than not being careful enough in the vineyard. So
Yeah.
we're very careful.
And how is this vineyard cultivated now? Do you obviously the team that you put in there is really important. They have to be a careful sort of patient team.
Yeah,
They're ungrafted.
they're ungrafted. They're on their own roots. So
Yeah.
we're very careful about visitors. If not having visitors, I mean, we've never really had visitors there, but we're very careful about who comes in. And certainly, if they've come from Victoria or New South Wales, it's they've got to wash clean their shoes, of course.
Yeah.
It's two people that my vineyard manager and his son prune it. We have people, obviously, we have a team that comes and picks it. It's organically farmed. We haven't got organic certification, but we're organically farming. We use a Dodge plough to undervine, so everything's sort of mechanically done, but again incredibly carefully because they are terribly fragile. You can't hit them.
Yeah.
And then we only use copper and sulfur, so they're it's basically organically farmed, but with it we haven't got the certification yet.
And would these have been bush trained originally? And they're on a trellis now.
Yeah,
How's it sort of evolved in the sense of managing the architecture of the vine?
it's actually not that hard to do, because once when you're pruning, you can, if you've got a bush vine, you can bring a cane up and put it on a wire, and that's happened. Well, we're on the third lift, if you like. So there was a very low lift in the beginning, then another lift, and then we did another lift. So they're at about chest height at the cordon now, and then after that we have catch wires, so we try not to let them fall over. So we're again catch wires for the foliage, and then they're trimmed. I mean, really, it's very minimal input. They're trimmed just to knock a bit of the excess growth off once they stop growing, so they don't roll out. And then and we do have to fruit thin it, believe it or not. Even though they're 1891 planted, they still put an incredible crop on every year. So most years we have to knock a bit of green fruit off to get the balance right on the vine. But you can imagine how deep the roots must be, given they were grown from 1891 until 1998. They were grown basically dry land, and then we had a little bit of irrigation water down there from bores, but they've only ever been irrigated very minimally. So
Yeah.
the root systems must be amazing, and the geology in McLaren Vale is amazing. I mean, the geology map of McLaren Vale is just a crazy thing. And on our vineyard, on our 40 hectares, there's probably 45 or 50 different soil types, but the sort of underlying geology is ironstone, so it's all ironstone country.
Mhm.
And then it's pretty much where these old vines are. It's red loam over ironstone, and it's full of ironstone schists, or not schist, but ironstone gravel.
Mm.
So it's well drained. They are planted on the contours, so the contour of the hills. So they follow the contour of the hills, which was done a lot in South Australia in the early days to stop the water rushing down the hill. So when you got rain, if you were
Mm.
contoured, it would gradually cascade down the hill, so you wouldn't waste all the water, wouldn't all rush to the bottom. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. But other than that, really simply managed, which is kind
Yeah.
of nice.
And do you observe any sort of intra-varietal diversity in this old vineyard? Is there sort of like evidence of different vines adapting in different ways, like in their phenology, or is it quite a consistent sort of
We
population?
we made what I thought was a good idea, and we planted Victorian ryegrass back in would have been the late 80s. I encouraged Dad to do it. We were doing it at Petaluma in the Adelaide Hills. So there's a natural ryegrass now. There's a natural ryegrass under story, and that's fine. And then, but because basically managing it organically. We don't spray it out, so we do dodge vine it, so and mow it. So that's the way we're controlling that. And then normally every second year we plant a cover crop. Now whether that's just a barley hay crop or for the cattle, or sometimes we use some good nitrogen fixing legumes, and that's just on a rotation basis. So we're trying to outcompete the weeds with things that we can control, which is one of the reasons we did ryegrass. But ryegrass tends to be difficult to get rid of if you want to get rid of it. The good thing is its roots only go down about an inch. So when the weather dries out, it's not really not majorly competing with the vines.
Yeah. And the vines themselves, is it a sort of a consistent population of vines? Do you see a lot of diversity between the different vines, or is it?
It feels to me when you're walking the vineyard and tasting the fruit, there's a difference. There's certainly a difference from the top of the block to the bottom of the block. And when I say top of the block, it's, as I said, it's only 2.5 hectares, so it's about 47 rows of vines. So it's not a huge difference in terms of altitude between the top and the bottom. But the top is what I make my ancestor vine Shiraz from, and I find that to be generally more aromatic, and they get sort of heavier as you go down the hill. So bigger, heavier. The grapes have a bigger flavour, not a bigger flavour, but a heavier flavour. So I prefer the top, sort of what I think makes more lighter, more elegant Shiraz. But it's pretty consistent. I mean, it is only 2.5 hectares. So, and then on the southern end of the vineyard, which you'd say southern end is going to be cold in our climate, but it's not that different. They tend to be quite a lot more vigorous on that southern end. So that's probably the only other difference. Otherwise, it's a very contiguous block. You can taste differences in the fruit as you're going through, but it's not huge. They're not huge differences, and they're not huge crop differences. And the vines don't look, the vines are pretty consistent. I mean, we prune them for consistency, but they also look pretty consistent through the growing season.
And this block, obviously, you have then another 40 hectares. What's the sort of planting history of that other 40 hectares? When was that planted? And do you observe any either vine physiology, grape composition, or even wine style differences that you think could be because of vine age, or do you think it's more to do with the sort of the micro terroir
Yeah.
of the origin?
There's a block to the immediately to the north of the ancestor block that is it's called block 6, but it's also Shiraz. It's Bob's clone, so it's rootlings, cuttings off the old vines, grafted onto rootlings. That block, and it's a very similar soil type even on the map, even on the soil map. It's pretty consistent. That's more like the old vines than any of the other blocks in any of the other patches in the block. So that's a beautiful block of grapes. And then it's all over the place in terms of altitude. I've got some blocks up a bit higher than this block. Most of the other plantings, certainly all the other Shiraz plantings, are all late 1990s. So and then, as I said earlier, I've got an old block of Cabernet and an old block of Cabernet Franc, but which I don't use myself at the moment, sadly. But most of the Shiraz is the Shiraz I use for my brand are all Bob's clones. So you see similarities. You can certainly see when I'm making different wines from different blocks. I keep them separate, and you can see the vineyard in each of those wines, which is really lovely. That you can actually see that they're brothers and sisters to the old vines. You really can taste some of that same character. But the ancestor vines are pretty special. It's a year in, year out. I mean, I've got the luxury of having seen the fruit since the late 1980s, and I'm still making wine from it now. And I've got back vintages going back to 2008, and when you put them in a lineup, you can really see that vineyard and that influence of that soil. I think soil's got so much to do with it. I mean, we all talk about soil, but I think that I know when Thomas Hardy was marketing these wines in the UK in the 1890s, he used to call them ferruginous reds, really good for you, like
Oh,
Guinness,
that is
really good for
great.
you. Yeah. So they were, even
Like a
back then,
tonic.
yeah,
Like
like
a
a tonic.
vitamin
Even back
tonic.
then they were good for you.
Yeah.
So, and some of the old ads, some of the old Hardy's ads from the 1890s, 1880s and 1890s, when they were advertising in both here and in London, were all about how the ferruginous qualities and how good it was for you. So, and when you think about our industry in South Australia, especially, a lot of the wineries were set up by doctors because it was safer to drink wine than it was to drink water. So, the health qualities of wine were very pronounced back then. So interesting that they used marketing back then even.
Yeah. Oh, if you can't sell it, you can't make it.
No,
So,
that's right. Exactly.
so Belinda, could you start sharing the slides again, if that's okay? Andrew, I'm going to ask you to tell us a bit more about, the wines the that you're making here,
Yeah.
and sort of the style and the approach to making those wines, sort of capturing this old vine quality. Um,
I think the really important thing about what we're doing is with the Olivine material is really letting. It sounds a bit cliche, but you really let the fruit do the talking. You want the site to talk to you in the wine, and so as far as winemaking is concerned, it's handpicked. It's some I use a bit of whole bunch, but not a lot. I get the whole bunch thing. I don't want to use too much. We get a lot of whole berries, so they're treated pretty gently. It's hand plunged into. It's crushed into generally 1 or 2 ton open fermenters, depending on how much I'm doing, and then hand plunged 3 times a day, and that's modified over the years, and then malolactic fermentation is carried out on skins, or starts on skins, and then as soon as it's getting towards sugar dryness, transfer to barrel. So it's a really simple winemaking style, and I'm not, like I said, I'm really trying to get the essence of what that vineyard tastes like in the wine, not so much winemaking artifact. And the barrels I've generally used over the years have been older French barriques and hogsheads. And again, that was, it's only normally 2 or 3 barrels, but that was again when I was thinking about it back in the 1980s. I was trying to emulate what Thomas Hardy would have done, and typically they didn't have barrel budgets, and a lot of it was done in Jarrah vats back then that were wax lined, so the oak influence was very minimal. So I sort of thought back then, well, do I want much oak character? And I've gently moved that over the years, and every now and then I do use a bit of new oak, and I might have 1 new barrel per year, maybe, just depending on how I feel, and what sort of vintage I think it's going to be. And the beauty of that is, once you really, by the time you pick the fruit, you've kind of made your mind up on what the vintage is going to be like. I mean, we're walking the vineyard a couple of times a week, and you're tasting the fruit, and you've been involved in the pruning. You've done, you've seen the growing season. You know how dry it's been. You know whether there's been any problems. So by the time you actually pick the fruit, I've normally got a picture in my head about what this is going to do. I mean, the amazing thing is, over the years, the picking dates have varied a bit. Like we've seen earlier and earlier picking, but generally, it's only by 10 days maybe. So
yeah.
these old vines tend to sort of self-regulate, I think,
Yeah.
even in the really warm years that we get down there.
And you're working with this picture of you and your son.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Henry's come back from England. He worked for Matthew Jukes in London. He was selling the Jukes cordialities, and
Oh, great.
and by the by, I got to taste some of the most. I mean, he'd send me photos of what he was tasting with Jukesy, and I was just so jealous. I mean, it was torture to see what he tasted for for 6 years working for Matthew. So that was a wonderful one. I mean, a fantastic grounding for him. And he was tasting wines that I've never tasted, and he got the benefit of Matthew's palate and the benefit of Matthew's generosity, which was amazing. So he's come back to work with us, and he'd be here as well, except he's on holidays. Little slacker.
You do let him have a holiday then.
He's allowed to have a holiday. He's got a year-old baby, or a bit over a year-old baby, so they take that quite seriously. But no, it's great fun. So he's sixth generation, so it's kind of nice to have him around the place. And he knew my father very well. His grandfather. He while Henry was at uni, Dad had gone partially blind, and so Henry used to drive him down to the vineyard twice a week.
Yeah.
And there are stories that grandfathers tell grandsons that they'd never tell his own son. So he knows stuff that I don't know. And every now and then, when we're having a couple of drinks, another story will float out of him, which is pretty neat. So it's been great fun having him in the business and working with him. So, and I did vow when he came back that I would not say no. If he came up with an idea of doing something, I didn't want to use the no word. So every now and then I got to pull him up, but most of the time I let him go. It's good fun.
So what have you said yes to that he's suggested?
Well, I've always, when I first released the Ancestor Vine Shiraz from the old vines, I released in early 2019, I released the 2008. So rather than having a current wine and a reserve wine, I said, well, we'll go with the 08. And then we obviously didn't have a 9, so we then went to 10. So 10 was released in 2020. So I was releasing a 10-year-old red. He came back and said, Dad, I want to release the 21. So we've just released the 21 a little bit earlier this year. So we've got the current old wine is 15, and that's kind of selling as well. That sells alongside the 2021. So that was an idea that he had that I thought I didn't want to do it particularly, but I've let him go with that. There's a few others that are kind of internal decisions that you think, oh well, okay, that makes sense. One of my other projects from the vineyard, I've got some very old Cinsault, and I've just planted some Grenache, and I wanted to make a rosé, and my wife Georgina wanted a rosé, and Henry did not want to do a rosé. And in the end, I just said to him, Henry, this is one of those times I'm going to tell you that what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it. So we made a small amount of rosé just for fun. But so there's a few things I've had to pull him up on, but most of the time it's good. And he knows the vineyard well enough over the years of going down with Dad and now coming down with me that I kind of know that when the time comes for me to drop off the perch, it's in good hands.
Yeah. And that must be really special to know that you've got this heritage legacy. I mean, wine businesses are really quite challenging to keep alive,
Yeah,
profitable. Family businesses have their own, rewards but challenges, and then family wine businesses in the farming sector, it's really it's really this intersection, isn't it, of all of
yeah.
these elements that can be so powerful when they come together. So
And it's hard. It's hard with my generation. It's hard with any generational business. But my brother and sister have an interest in it, and obviously part own the vineyard. But they don't really have that much of a connection, other than they love it. They love the connection, but there's no day to day. Or my brother's helping a bit with accounts and some other things. But and then you have your own children, and we've got 4 kids, and only one of them's really interested in the others all love drinking it, but they're not that interested in the way it operates. So that's another challenge that all farming families have, of what happens with the kids' siblings. Who's going to get not who's going to get what, but who's going to end up running it or running with the business. So they're all interesting challenges with family farms.
Yeah. And yet they bring, I think, some of the most beautiful wines. So just to, so you mentioned Matthew Jukesy, of course, he's been an incredible champion and advocate for really the highest possible quality wines coming from Australia, this sense of really the narrative of Australian fine wine heritage. And actually it was Matthew's reviews that first brought the Ox Hardy ancestor Shiraz sort of onto my radar. He, I think, has been one of a very long sort of advocate, hasn't he? A long-standing
Yeah.
advocate, seeing what you're working with and your wines. But actually, this wine from this ancestor vineyard um, has also received incredibly, consistent, absolute rave reviews from all the major um,
Yeah.
publications and critics. How do you go about sort of putting it into the market? So, how many bottles do you make of this ancestor
There's
Shiraz?
normally sort of 900 to 1,200 bottles, so it's pretty small production. Um, we we sell it. We started out selling it in threes, boxes of three. A lot of it's now sold in. It comes in a cardboard box, on its own bottle. We have very good distribution in Australia with Negociants, which is a company
Yeah,
set up by the Hillsmiths, so that they distribute Australia wide. In the UK, Goodhouse Watterson have been carrying it since Dukesy introduced us to them. So that's been a really lovely arrangement. And it's just it's a lot of it's word of mouth, and yes, the write-ups and the points really help. Obviously, I mean that gets people thinking about it, talking about it, and as you've said, that's what came to your attention. And I think that the history behind it is pretty nice. Sorry, whatever, another Shiraz on the market that's expensive, but I think the story behind it is quite compelling. And I think once you get people once people taste it, not everybody's going to buy a wine that's that expensive, but it's certainly nice to show them. So it sells, it ticks through. We'd obviously, if we could sell more, we probably would. But I like the fact that it's a small production. We want it to sell out every year and sort of keep it going. It's a finite resource, if you know what I mean.
do you sort of like to share it out among your key markets? Do you see this as like an ambassador
Yeah.
for so much of this still untold story behind Australian fine wine? Is that how you like to sort of deploy it?
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. It is sort of an ambassador for, it's small production for a start. It's an ambassador for my brand, and it sort of shows what I mean. It's lovely to have the old vines. And I think I think you know about the iconic wines. There's 5 Shiraz made in McLaren Vale that are identifiably from 1800 vineyards, and this is one of them. So we're sort of going out to the world a bit with that as well, saying there are 5 wines that come from 1800 vines that have their own label, and they are from those patches. So that's we're sort of getting that out there, and I think you want the flow down, obviously the flow down to be you want it to reflect on the rest of the wines you make, and all the reds that I make from that vineyard. But it's a lovely thing to have, and but yeah, it's an ambassador, if you like, for Blewett Springs and McLaren Vale,
Yeah.
and for my brand.
And McLaren Vale, is it fair to say, by the way, I'm just going to put in the chat the link to this. It's Living Icons, it's called, isn't it? This
Living icons, that's right.
collective of incredible all 1800 planted vines. So it's Paxton, Ox Hardy, Richard Hamilton, Kay Brothers, and Darrenberg. And they've sort of come together to highlight that these producers are all making from these 1800 planted vines. I'm just going to put it into the chat. How do I do the chat?
And
Sorry.
it's quite a lovely story. And one of the side stories of that is that Kay Brothers is my neighbour. So Kay Brothers, literally, we have a dirt road between us and them. That to the west of our place, and the Kay Brothers, the original Kay Brothers, used to keep it, and they still keep a diary of what happens every day. And there's a lovely entry in 1892 that I think Fred Kay wrote. I just can't remember that. One of the Kay brothers, anyway, wrote and said Tom Hardy called in today with 6,000 rootlings. So Thomas Hardy had brought over to K's 6,000, or it might have been 1,000, might have been 1,200 rootlings from Upper Tintara, from our place to K's. So the K's Block 6, which is their 1892 planting, is from cuttings from our place. So it's a really cool, really nice side story about the cooperation back then
That's
of
really beautiful.
neighbours. Yeah.
And they still keep this journal, do they? This is what happened on such and such a day.
Yeah, they still keep it. So Duncan, who's the winemaker there now, every day there's I'm not sure whether he does it or whether Colin Kay does it, but there's a diary every day of kind of, what went on or how much rain had. I mean, I do it myself as well. I keep a diary every day. You only got to write 1 or 2 words just to jog your memory,
Yeah.
and it helps you jog your memory about when you're writing about the wine or when you're talking about that vintage. Winemakers tend to remember every vintage, believe it or not. I mean, my first vintage was 83, so I kind of remember every vintage, or bits and pieces of them anyway.
Yeah.
They're all starting, I've got to say, they're starting to blur a bit these days. But
And you mentioned also that you see this wine as being an ambassador for McLaren Vale alongside these other living icons. Do you think there's an aspect of McLaren Vale kind of coming more into the spotlight? I don't know whether it's um, fair from my perspective, but it always seemed to me McLaren Vale to be sort of slightly less prominent than, say, Barossa, for example, for these, especially these sort of Shiraz and even sort of McLaren Vale, very known for Grenache. But it feels to me like McLaren Vale is becoming more, valued and credited.
I think it's a good point. I think the Barossa sort of got a real kudos of its own, and you think about the brands that have come out of the Barossa. When you think about, I mean, the obvious one's Penfolds Grange, and then you start talking about Henschke, Hill of Grace, and all those other lovely brands up there. McLaren Vale was always more of a workhorse region, and I don't know whether it's a fluke, but certainly when Dad came out of Roseworthy in the late 40s, that most of the wines that Hardy's made in that era were blends, and they had these legendary winemakers, Colin Priest, Roger Warren, Dick Heath, who, and one of Dad's first jobs was going with Roger Warren, and they'd start in Stanthorpe, which is in Queensland, and it's a high country in Queensland. They'd go up there and buy wine, come down through the Hunter, buy wine, go through Victoria, buy wine, come back into South Australia, and they'd often end up at AP Burke's at Wendouree in Clare, and they'd buy, 1,000 gallons here and 500 gallons there and 250 gallons there, and they'd bring them all back to South Australia and do the blends. So, in fact, I had lunch with an old mate of mine the other day, Paul Lapsley, who was chief winemaker at Hardy's, and we'd bought a bottle of 1961. My birth year, by the way, but 1961 Hardy's bin, I think it was C354, which was a Hunter River McLaren Vale Shiraz. So it would have been a wine that Dad may well have had something to do with going and buying. That bought the Hunter component, and then the McLaren Vale component came from our own vineyards off these vines, and the wine was still absolutely beautiful, spectacular. I mean, it was just, even notwithstanding the cork was just about gone, but the wine still had life. You could taste my vineyard in it. So those sort of, those, I don't know why I got onto blending from different regions, but I think
Because McLaren Vale would have gone into the
yeah,
blends. Yeah.
yeah, and then there was, you think back to the McLaren Vale brands. There was Hardy's, there was Darrenberg was 1912, Richard Hamilton. So a lot of these companies in the McLaren Vale were using fruit and wine from all over the place, whereas Barossa tended to be, much more down the line. I mean, notwithstanding Grange is a blend from everywhere from the 50s, but I think the Barossa sort of had more of a. It's funny. It's a beautiful. I mean, they're both beautiful parts of South Australia. The Barossa is full of beautiful old houses, huge gum trees. McLaren Vale is a bit more. If I say workmanlike, it's going to sound slightly snobbish, but it's a bit more of a working area than the Barossa was. They had wool, they had wheat, and they had wine as well. The Vale was more about growing stuff because it was so close to Adelaide, growing food foodstuffs and also wine, obviously, for the local population. So different sort of eras and different sort of ways that the wineries are set up. But I think the Barossa style of march on us, and maybe that, you know, when the Masters of Wine came out in 85 or 86, whenever it was the first time,
Yeah.
with Hazel, maybe that was, you know, that sort of kicked off the whole Barossa boom thing, because certainly that was the beginning of the boom into the UK. And
Yeah.
the Barossa brands were strong, and they were probably, I hate to say it, but they're probably stronger than the McLaren Vale brands at the time.
Yeah. Well, I think that the how you've brought this sort of passion family project, which has been very much almost about like keeping this family connection alive for many years, now into really sort of an ambassadorial wine range for McLaren Vale. And also, it's kind of like a homage, isn't it, to all of the generations that have gone before, as well as this
Yeah,
genetic heritage. The wine, by the way, so this ancestor vine Shiraz retails for about £120 from Good House Waddington. Fantastic importer. You know, there you can't get much for £100 in of these very fine wines from all over the world. I actually think the pricing is incredibly fair. This is a wine that's made in less than 1,000 bottles. It's an absolute piece of living wine history. Obviously, an amazing wine. And I would really encourage those here today and those watching on catch up as well. Do go and check out these wines. You can also, of course, experience the wines that are, if you like, the junior relatives of this ancestor vine Shiraz. But we were lucky to taste these wines at our Old Vine Conference trade tasting in London in the summer, and we had an incredible response. And Andrew, I'd like to thank you for all the work that you do, for your customary frankness and generosity in sharing your knowledge, your experience, and we really look forward to tasting future vintages of the wine. Thank you also for being part of the Old Vine Conference community. It's to have people who do what you do, the quality you do it with the commitment that you do it in the network is incredibly valuable. So thank you for sharing that. I think that it really shows why Australia is so successful when you have this sort of collaborative generosity.
thank you, Sarah. And I feel only slightly guilty about sitting here drinking it, but I know not the time of day for you. Although there's never a time like now, is it, to drink a
Yeah.
bit of bread? But it's been lovely talking to you all, and I hope the Old Vine project still, you know, generates some more excitement. I think the wines, when you taste all the Old Vine wines, they are pretty spectacular from all around the world. But
Yeah.
I think that the Australian story is pretty compelling.
There's a whole narrative of Australian fine wine heritage, which is now being told. Andrew Kyle, we mentioned. Obviously, it's being told through the wines. I would just like to highlight that in 2027, the Institute of Masters of Wine is coming back to Australia, and we're holding our symposium in Adelaide. And I will be hosting a session on old vine heritage with a focus on Australian old vine heritage. And I know that Andrew Kayard is also hosting a tasting at that symposium focused on Australia's old vine heritage. And I think that old vine lens is so important for telling this story of as Andrew says, I've been reading his book too, so my head's full of his words. Generations of effort, and this kind of very ancient land that's become this very beautiful, almost new but yet very old terroir for
Yeah.
wine. So I think we'll continue that whole support with the Institute of Masters of Wine, and I think that's going to be an incredible event. And we're so delighted, I know, to be coming back to Australia to do it. So thank you.
That'll be great. That'll be good fun. They're always good tastings, those MW tastings. So
Yeah. Yeah, not too shabby. More
Yeah.
details on Institute of Masters of Wine website, Andrew's incredible wine range, and other projects you can see at Oxhardy Wines. And is there anything you want to just wrap up with, Andrew? Anything you want to point us towards before we?
No, I just think the your point about before about the old vine projects that are happening here, it is it is incredibly important. I mean, on their own they sound like expensive wines, but when you look at the history behind them, it's fantastic and compelling. And I think the wines do the wines do speak for themselves. When you, as you said, when you did your tasting in the summer, the wines do speak for themselves, and they do show amazingly well. And you can, I mean, as I said, I'm lucky enough to see the multiple vintages of them, back vintages, but you can see the vineyard in each of those wines. It doesn't matter of certainly those five that are the living icons. You can taste the vineyard in them, and again, the wines that are made in the Barossa with some of the other old vines, and indeed Hamish's wines over there in Victoria. It's great to see what was vineyard site selection, terroir selection back then. They were dealing with terroir in the 1800s. And these were people that came from either England or Germany, and came to this strange land and made wines, planted vineyards, and made wines that were, have stood the test of time. So it's a kind of really neat history that to transplant old world thinking to the new world back then, with all the dangers that were going on and the hardships of it, and for some of them to still be living. So it's a good thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you, Hamish has said thanks for your great insight to your family and historical stamp on Australia's wine and world history. And I think back at you, Hamish, we look forward, we'd love
Yeah,
to have you on and hear the sort of the Victoria story as well. I think that because that's also an incredible narrative, I know.
it is.
Thank
It is.
you. Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we will have this session available to watch on Catch Up as well. Please do get in touch with any follow-up questions, either for us or for Andrew. I know we'll be delighted to pass them on.
Thank you very much. Lovely to
Cheers.
meet. Lovely to see
Have
you.
a glass for us.
I will. I will. I'm having one now.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks,
Thanks
everyone.
very much.
Bye for
Okay.
now.
Bye bye.
Bye.